So, thank you for joining us today for our program, America and the Holocaust, a series of colloquies with Dr. Michael Berenbaum. I'd also like to thank our partner for today's event. We have Liberation 75 and the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida. For those of you joining us for the first time, although I don't think that's so many of you, my name is Erica Fox-Zabuski, and I am the operations manager at Classrooms Without Borders. I'm filling in for Ellen Resnick, who is currently traveling with our cohort in the Poland Personally seminar. And I'm joined today by my colleague, Jackie Goldblum, who is our seminars manager and who is helping us today. So it's great to see you again. If you can, we hope you'll consider turning your camera on so we can see your faces, and so our speakers and our guests also can have a sense that there's a live audience out there, and we can make sure you're not falling asleep on us. So that's great. Love to see you all. So the past 6 months, Dr. Berenbaum has explored the complicated subject of America's entry into World War II with us. And he's featured scholars whose work has shed new light on the topic and challenged us to reframe our understanding of the complex portrait of national action or inaction. We have learned about Varian Fry, Ben Hecht, and today we're going to learn about Representative Saul Bloom and the moral conflicts of an American Jewish congressman during the Holocaust. We'll be speaking with author Elliot Resnick. So at the end of today's program, we're going to give you a test to make sure you remember everyone who you learned about in the last 6 months. No, I'm just kidding. So if you don't already receive our program newsletter, you can sign up for it. And I will put the link into the chat because sometimes people come here through other friends or other ways. So we want to make sure that people can sign up. Oops, I better put this for everyone. Get that there. All right, so that's to get our newsletter. So as you know, Classrooms Without Borders is a premier provider of experiential professional development for teachers, educational leaders, and lifelong learners. We offer unique travel experiences and virtual learning opportunities enriched with academic literature, relevant content, and resources to enhance the learning experience. We do this through authentic exploration of a complex narrative, engaging with scholars, fellow educators, experts, and contemporary witnesses, with the primary focus being the importance that historic place plays in our shared history. We are so grateful for you and all your support over the years, especially the last few years as we have built and expanded our virtual presence. In the past 3 years alone, we've offered over 440 virtual programs with over 72,000 registered participants. We reach almost 60 countries and most states in the US, indicating that we are indeed a classroom that does not have any borders. If you would like to make a donation to support our programs, I'll drop the link in the chat for you in a moment. But first, I'd like to introduce today's guests. First, we have Dr. Michael Berenbaum, who is a writer, lecturer, and teacher consulting in the conceptual development of museums and historical films. He is professor of Jewish studies at American Jewish University, where he is also the director of the Ziggy Ziering Institute, whose mission is to explore the ethical and religious implications of the Holocaust. Elliot Resnick received his PhD in Jewish studies from Yeshiva University and is the author of several books, including Movers and Shakers, 60 Prominent Personalities Speak Their Mind on Tape, and there are 3 volumes of that. The other book is Perfection, the Jewish Ideal, and the soon-to-be published America First, the story of Saul Bloom, the most powerful Jew in Congress during the Holocaust. He is the former chief editor of the Jewish Press and the author of a forthcoming article in the Hakira Journal titled, Why Didn't America Save the 6 Million? If you have questions, you can send them to Michael Berenbaum directly in the chat, and we'll try our best to answer all of them. And with that, I will turn the program over to Dr. Berenbaum. Michael, go ahead.
Okay. First of all, it's a pleasure to be with you all today. And this is really the end of a long journey going through various aspects of the United States and the Holocaust during this period of time. We have a special guest today who has taught me an awful lot, and that is that I had the opportunity to read his forthcoming book. And I have to say that it transformed my understanding of who was Congressman Saul Bloom and what he sought to achieve, and was enormously important in my understanding of the United States and the Holocaust, most especially the working of Congress. So I have to first of all thank Elliot Resnick for his contribution. And then having thanked him, let's grill him and see what we can learn from him. My first question to you, and I'm going to call him Elliot, though we can call him Dr. Resnick, will feel comfortable. I feel much more comfortable in first names. So tell us for a moment, who was Saul Bloom and why was he important? And how pivotal was he in Congress at these incredibly important years?
So, first of all, thank you so very much for having me and for that very kind introduction. Saul Bloom was the most powerful Jew in Congress during the war years. There were anywhere between 5 and 8 Jews serving in Congress between 1939 and 1945. I believe there are 37 Jews serving in Congress now. There were only 6, 7, or 8 back then. And Bloom was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the House of Representatives. And that committee, of course, is extremely important during a time of World War. That actually was the committee through which FDR passed his cash and carry and lend-lease legislation through. Those were bitter fights to pass those pieces of legislation because there was much opposition to America getting involved in World War II, even indirectly through England, because many Americans thought they had been tricked into entering World War I. They did not want to enter World War II or even help England fight off the Nazis because they thought that was step one to getting involved in the war. I think someone compared it to a barrel going over Niagara Falls. Once it's starting to go over Niagara Falls, it will come all the way down. And so there was much opposition, and Bloom helped get those pieces of legislation through. And without those pieces of legislation, England may have been forced to surrender to the Nazis, or at least be forced to sue for peace. And had that been the case, it's very likely that most of England's 300,000 Jews would have been killed by the Nazis, and most of Palestine's 400,000 Jews likely would have been killed by the Nazis as well, since it was English troops that stopped the Nazi advance toward Palestine in 1942 in North Africa.
Let's go back and let's start at the very beginning. And I want to ask you several questions. You know, when we refer to a Jew in Congress, one always has to ask the question, what type of Jew? And was it a Jew who was part of the community or apart from the community? Was it a Jew who was comfortable in his Jewish identity, or who was seeking to hide his Jewish identity and as it were, not to advance for fear that it would be parochial interests, not to advance what could be perceived as Jewish interests? Tell us a little bit about Saul Bloom, the man, for a moment, and Saul Bloom, the Jew.
Okay, so Milton Steinberg once characterized a certain kind of Jew in that era as being a scared, sick-souled, tied in knots Jew. The type of Jew you were describing, who was very uncomfortable with his Jewish identity. Bloom was the opposite of that.
Let's also say Milton Steinberg was a rabbi of Park Avenue Synagogue and a very fine author and novelist. And we still read today his novel As a Driven Leaf, which is a wonderful introduction to the world of the rabbis in novel form, telling us about what it was like to live during the rabbinic era. So he was both a proud Jew and a perceptive Jew who had a real feel for what was happening. And I guess one could say at Park Avenue Synagogue, he had both types of Jews in his congregation.
I imagine so. And so, yes.
Now let's now go back to Saul Bloom.
Yes, so thank you. So there were these two types of Jews. Bloom was in the latter category. He was a very proud Jew. In fact, there was a profile written about him in 1939 in the American Hebrew, and the subtitle of that article was "The Story of Saul Bloom, Who is Mighty Proud That He's a Jew." Saul Bloom had a mezuzah on his congressional office. He had a picture of the Kol Nidre service in his congressional office. He was once called Rabbi Bloom by one of his colleagues because he was speaking about Jewish issues at some congressional hearing. He talks about his Jewishness to a great extent in his autobiography. He admits that he was basically chosen to run for Congress. He represented portions of the Upper West Side, portions of Harlem, Morningside Heights. So the Upper West Side, essentially, of Manhattan. He represented that area, a very Jewish area. And he writes in his biography, I was chosen to run for Congress because I was a solvent Jew, basically. So he was very outspoken about it. One of his colleagues said after he passed away at a memorial service in Congress that Saul Bloom was a Jew and not ashamed about it, not self-conscious about it. And so, yes, you're right. Many Holocaust historians seem to portray Bloom as a timid and insecure Jew. But it's very clear if you start looking at his life that he was not timid, he was not insecure. I'll just end with one little story. In 1932, he was the director of the bicentennial celebration for George Washington's 200th birthday. Washington being born in 1732. And some congressmen were in his office, and these were descendants of people from the Mayflower or other distinguished families in America. And they were discussing their ancestors. And at a certain point, they turned to Saul Bloom and they said, oh, we apologize. You must be a little bit uncomfortable that we're discussing our illustrious ancestors. And he said, no, it's okay. I have Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob as my ancestors. So this is not somebody who is uncomfortable with people knowing about his Jewishness.
And let's talk a little bit about his responsibility. I'm also want to pick up on something you said, which I think is quite important. The Lend-Lease legislation, which essentially got through the House of Representatives thanks to Saul Bloom, not only was important for England, but ultimately it turned out to be vital for the United States. And that is vital for the United States because it woke up the military industrial complex for military to create ammunition, tanks, armaments, and the like. And that got us into a position that when we indeed entered World War II, and we only entered World War II in December of 1941, we already had the productive capacity to field an army. But describe for us a little bit about the opposition in the 30s to participation, what we might call the American First movement of the 1930s.
Right, so there was a very strong isolationist stream in American society. They said, we're entering World War I was a mistake. We don't want to enter another world war. And yes, Hitler might be bad, but we have the Atlantic Ocean separating us from Europe. And then in the later stages, they said, look, the Nazis couldn't cross the 20 miles of the English Channel. What are the chances of them crossing, I think, the 3,000 miles or 2,000 miles of the Atlantic Ocean? We'd have nothing to worry about. We could protect ourselves. Now, the argument on the other side was that you might be right militarily speaking for the moment, but first of all, Hitler would not have to attack America directly. He could enter the Western Hemisphere through South America and then attack America from the South ultimately. So that's number one. And number two, they said, even if we could stave off the Nazis for a while, if Hitler controls all of Europe, he controls all of European economy, and if he'll use that economic power to basically blackmail us, the same way, let's say, America now is trying to put a stranglehold around Russia through economic means. So Putin is avoiding it a little bit by turning towards China and India, but there was no China and India market really to speak of back then. So if Hitler controlled all of Europe, he would use that economic power to sort of strangle America, and over time, it would be harder and harder for America not to institute policies that would be friendly towards Hitler. So this was the opposing argument, but there was a very strong argument the other way, which is we don't want to get involved. This is not our business. Let's just stay here and build up our defenses here in America and make sure Hitler never invades America, and we'll be fine. And Bloom and FDR were trying to combat this movement and this strong isolationist stream, but it was very tricky. And they have to be very careful in how they did it. And one of the main reasons people like FDR or Bloom and even American Jewish leaders and Jewish activists did not push for greater Jewish immigration to America during the 1930s, mid-1930s, even late 1930s, was because they realized immigration was very unpopular. And if FDR needs to use his political capital to try to nudge America towards war or nudge America towards arming England, he has to use all of his political capital towards that end. He can't afford to get into a political fight over immigration or give his opponents a weapon to use against him, which is the immigration fight. And
One of the points we've been making throughout this is that some people had a deep hesitation to, what shall we say, to make sure that the war was not called or about to be called a Jewish war, because that would have only strengthened the opposition to any activist position on the part of the United States. What was Blum? Did Blum have any hesitation about that? Did Blum have any concern about that?
he did indeed, and he actually writes in his autobiography that one of the reasons, apparently according to congressional procedure, he should have been the one to introduce the resolution declaring war on Germany. And he said, I don't want to do that because I don't want it to be known now and in history that a Jew got America into war. So he conferred with the head of parliamentary procedure in Congress, and they found a way of him sort of sidestepping that formal obligation of him to introduce the war resolution. So he was very conscious of the fact that of his opponents calling this war a Jewish war, and he was constantly trying to sidestep it. I believe one of the resolutions, maybe it was even Lend-Lease, I don't remember exactly, because he was the chairman of the committee, a lot of bills that came out of his committee were called the Blum bill. And again, there was movement made that he should not be introducing one of these key pieces of legislation. It should be somebody else, because he didn't want the opponents to have the ability to call it the Blum bill. So yes,
let's restate the obvious. With the name Saul Blum in 1939, 40, 41, 42, 43, you could not avoid the perception that you were Jewish.
yes,
And that as Blum had the feel for a Jewish name. It wasn't one of these nondescript names. And Saul also was very much considered a Jewish first name. You know, my own father was called Saul, and that was part of what that generation did as they Americanized their names. That was one of the names that Jews who were born in Eastern Europe chose for themselves, identifiably and deliberately Jewish, because my father certainly was not called Saul when he was born.
Right. And every once in a while, actually, you'll see among Blum's critics at the time, they'll call him Solomon Blum. I think to emphasize even more that he clearly was Jewish.
Yeah. What was his relationship with Franklin Delano Roosevelt?
So he was a loyal party man, and he loved FDR, like many Jews at the time loved FDR. You and I'm sure many listeners of this program know that there was this line that Jews had three worlds. The Yiddish word for world is Welt. So they had this Welt, the next Welt, and Roosevelt. Those are the three worlds, the three Welts that Jews believed in. He was a loyal party man to FDR. But again, I think we have to think back the way things were back then. There's a reason the Jews virtually worshipped FDR. There's a reason why the American Jewish at the time did not really criticize FDR. You know, sometimes when you hear criticism of FDR or criticism of American Jewry, I should say, it almost sounds like that we care about the 6 million more than our ancestors did. And that's obviously absurd, because the 6 million were the parents, the siblings, and the cousins of our ancestors. So they cared about the 6 million more than we did. And yet they respected and regarded and held FDR in high esteem, because again, remember, FDR took us through the Great Depression. Now, it's true he didn't technically solve the Great Depression. I think unemployment was still 19% in 1938, but FDR gave the country a tremendous amount of hope, and that hope arguably took us through the Great Depression. He recognized the Nazi threat way before other people did, and Jews appreciated that, and he prepared the country to fight the Nazis. And again, American Jews appreciated that. He hired many Jews in his administration. I think 15% of his appointees were Jewish. The New Deal was even called the Jew Deal by some of his opponents. That's how friendly he was seen to being for the Jews. He was regarded as caring about the Jews. The Evian conference today is slammed as being an embarrassment, a total failure, and it was, but he called for the Evian conference. If FDR didn't care about the Jews at all, why is he even calling for the Evian conference? So the Jews saw him as a friend.
Let me interrupt you only to touch on that because it's important. Number one, he also was he was governor of New York. You can't be governor of New York without having relationships with the New York Jewish community. Still to this day, the largest Jewish community in the world, more Jews in New York City than any other city in the world, including all any individual city of Israel. But the other, and you couldn't function in the political world of New York without being engaged and involved in Jews. I want to touch on the Evian conference because we're going to come to the Bermuda conference, which is all important. And I want to pick up on a word you said. There are two scholars, Richard Brightman and Alan Lichtman, who essentially said the way to understand FDR is to understand what his concern was in any given year. 1933 onward, it was, in the words of Bill Clinton, it's the economy, stupid. And that is when he came in, his concern was the economy. That was his number one concern, two concern, three concern, four concern. And then he had a little bit of space for something else. By 1938, something else happened to Roosevelt, which is he had got a little bit of breathing room and a little bit of political capital that he could spend on other things. And one of the elements of that political capital was the Evian conference, which, though it didn't succeed, at least raised the issue in a very real way. One more thing about the Evian conference is that they used the word refugee instead of using the JEW word, because in the words of Henry Feingold, if they used the JEW word, if they called it the Jews, then everybody would be against receiving refugees. If they called it refugees, you had a better chance. But by 1939, he had a different priority, and this is the political capital. They claim, and I'd like to find your opinion on it, they claim that by 1939, Roosevelt knew two things that the American people did not know. He knew, number one, that he was going to run for a third term that nobody else had ever run for, and nobody else will ever run for. And number two, he knew that America was somehow going to have to enter the war, even though he ran as a relatively speaking peace candidate, and America had to be prepared to enter the war. And consequently, he was very cautious about how much political capital he was going to expend in 1939. What's your sense of that argument?
Well, I'm not an expert on Roosevelt. From what I've read, though, it seems like Roosevelt is a very hard man to figure out. He never wrote a diary, so we don't know his inner thoughts. And he seemed to often make everyone who met him think that he agreed with that particular person. He was a very good politician. He would smile and laugh. Emmanuel Seller, who was a Jewish congressman from Brooklyn, said every time I left a meeting with Roosevelt, I realized that I had been mesmerized. So FDR was very good at making people think he agreed with them. It's not always clear what FDR thought at any given moment. So
yeah, and the judgment of historians is that Roosevelt, they debate whether he had a grade B or a grade C intellect, but everybody agrees he had a grade A personality.
yes, indeed.
And that was true. That was true with everybody who encountered Roosevelt. By the way, including somebody like Jan Karski, who was in a pivotal moment with Roosevelt. So we got through the Lend-Lease agreement, and Lend-Lease was the agreement to provide war material for Great Britain, which essentially preserved Great Britain, gave it the capacity to I don't want to say win the Battle of Britain, but not lose the Battle of Britain, which was equally important. Take us through then him beyond 1939 and his role, and I want to get fairly quickly to the Bermuda Conference.
So I would say maybe perhaps two things quickly about the war years, because the accusation against the Roosevelt administration has several components. One of the main components, again, is this immigration policy. How come he didn't admit more Jews into the United States? He wouldn't have even needed to change the laws because, except I think for 1939, even the limited quotas for immigration to the United States were not filled. So how come he didn't even at least fill the existing quotas? And once the war started, there was apparently a huge scare of Nazis spies coming into the US through the refugee population, or the Nazis using the refugees as a way of infiltrating the US, meaning if you had a relative in Europe, they might say to a refugee, well, your mother here is still here in Germany, you better help us or we'll kill your mother. And there was a huge scare at the time, partially because countries like France, Belgium, they fell so quickly in a matter of weeks. People were convinced Hitler would not have been able to conquer these countries unless there was a fifth column within. So people were paranoid about there being a fifth column within the United States. And it's clear, at least as far as Blum is concerned, this wasn't just some statement you made to the public. I found several letters of Blum written to in private letters saying, you know, I would love to help this person, but I really need more information on this person because I really have to make sure this person is not a Nazi spy or something of that nature. He said I have to be scared about the fifth column, the sixth column, the seventh column. And so there was this scare. And that's one of the main reasons why more immigrants were not allowed into the United States. Now, again, in hindsight, you could say this was all ridiculous. I think there was only one Jew who was found to be even partially used by the Nazis as a spy to infiltrate the United States. But that's hindsight. In hindsight, it's 2020. Now we know it wasn't a problem. At the time, it's a world war. You're scared.
By the way, in hindsight, we have now had a series of books about the impact of the German-American community and their cooperation with the German consuls in the various cities. The book of the Nazis of Copley Square, the spy network that was established in Los Angeles to spy upon the cooperation of the German consul and the German-American Bund. And we're having a series of regional studies of this. So there were spies already in the United States for Germany. They were coordinating with the consuls. And ironically, as you well know, only in 1942-43 did the Americans discover they had a phenomenal asset for the war effort, and that was German-American Jewish refugees who spoke the language natively, who knew the culture intuitively, and who then became the Ritchie boys and part of advanced American intelligence, and also part of the interrogation teams at Nuremberg and all of that. Let's contrast for a moment. We have an interesting question by a very interesting scholar by the name of Yitzchak Kerem, who wants us to contrast a little bit Blum with someone like Henry Morgenthau and with somebody like Bernard Baruch.
So my knowledge of those two people is limited. One thing I will say about Henry Morgenthau, which I've always found interesting, so people like you know very well, Raphael Medoff is the leader, I guess, of the anti-FDR crowd. He praises Morgenthau tremendously because Morgenthau helped create the War Refugee Board. Someone like Raphael Medoff, I think, has to answer a very basic question. How is it, if FDR is such a terrible person, and that's what Raphael Medoff portrays FDR to be, if he was such a terrible person, how is it that a hero like Henry Morgenthau was such good friends with him? Because they were very good friends. So something is off there, I think.
Well, I think something's off because I think that we have to take a little bit of a different role. But talk about the type of Jew that Blum was. He was what shall we say, was far more ethnic, far more rooted in the community than Henry Morgenthau, who had been an elite, a member of the Jewish financial elite, and his father had been ambassador to Turkey, and was really quite what shall we say, an upper class culturally assimilated Jew, versus Saul Blum, who was a West Side Jew.
Right. Later in life. I mean, so first of all, his parents came from Poland, so he's Eastern European, and he actually grew up though in San Francisco. And when I was doing research on Saul Blum, it seems like San Francisco was a very unique Jewish community. Because it was a very new community, Jews there felt very comfortable. It was just as much their city as anyone else's city, meaning they didn't come to an existing city like New York. San Francisco was, I think, a small Mexican village until 1847, roughly. So Jews were there from the very beginning, and apparently there are several historians who argue that Jews were more comfortable in San Francisco than they were anywhere else in the country. And they were a little bit more cosmopolitan than Jews were anywhere else in the country. So Bloom, perhaps one reason he felt so comfortable with his Jewishness was because he grew up in San Francisco, as opposed to growing up in New York or one of the other major Jewish cities in America.
Now let's move forward to Saul Bloom participated in the Bermuda Conference. And that's one of the issues that was enormously complex. And the Bermuda Conference, we should say, was held on April 19th, 1943, which is a pivotal date because that's also the date of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it's also the first day of Passover, which made it a little bit uncomfortable for Jewish organizations to fully participate in the Bermuda Conference. It was held in Bermuda, which was a restricted island at that point. But tell us about the role of Saul Bloom there.
So first of all, as you brought to my attention, by that point, 3/4 of the Jews who would be murdered in the Holocaust had already been murdered. In March of 1942, 3/4 of those Jews were still alive. By February 1943, 3/4 of those Jews were dead. So that's number one, something to keep in mind. The Bermuda Conference was held not long after a cable was confirmed to be true by the State Department. This cable essentially came from a source within Germany saying the Nazis have a plan to exterminate the Jewish people. There had been many stories of Jews being killed, but this was kind of the first semi-official confirmation that there was an actual plan to exterminate the Jewish people. And there was pressure both in England and in America for these two countries to do more, and they decided to have a conference in Bermuda to discuss what could be done more, and we'll pass on these recommendations to the Intergovernmental Committee on Refugees, which had been set up several years earlier. Now, if you want to attack Bloom about this conference, what you probably could say is that Bloom should not have gone to the conference altogether, because he was picked as there was only these delegations from England and America were just 3-member delegations. So a very few select group of people were gathered in Bermuda. Delegations with 3 members, and they had advisors with them. So Bloom probably should not have gone, you could argue, because their governments, both England and America, made it very clear to these delegations before they left that you really can't do very much to save Jews. First of all, the conference shouldn't really be about Jews, like the Evian conference. Let's discuss refugees, all refugees. Now, if you read the minutes of the conference, they are discussing Jews most of the time, but at least officially it was not about Jews. But second of all,
but we have to say, and again, Elliot, you know this as well as I do, we have to say that it was the equivalent of the word you didn't utter. You spoke around it, but you didn't say it. Everybody knew what you were speaking about, but God forbid you should utter a 3-letter word, which was a dangerous word to utter.
Right, in one of the documents sent back to England by I think the head of the English delegation, he wrote to his superior that the American delegation was very concerned about it not being a Jewish issue. He said, on the other hand, every single time we came up with a proposal to help Jews, they were very excited, because it was very clear that the point was to help Jews. But all major solutions to help Jews have been taken off the table really before the conference even began. It was agreed upon by the two governments that Palestine would not be open for Jewish immigration, which was a major avenue of escape.
Let's make clear, folks, we're talking about the name of the territory in 1943. In 1948, most of that territory became the state of Israel. So we're not entering into contemporary politics. We're speaking as historians, and I just want to make sure that you understand that. That was Palestine at that point, referred to, and Jews, in fact, were called Palestinians at that point. Just want to make clear, because don't want to enter into political discussion about Israel at this moment. I want to handle this topic. Go ahead, Elliot, I interrupted you.
No, thank you, I appreciate it. I think Golda Meir used to make that point as well. But in any event, so that avenue of escape was taken off the table. Immigrating to America also was taken off the table. It was made very clear to the delegation there will be no exception to the existing immigration quotas. And also they were told we will not be negotiating with the Nazis, because that was one of the major suggestions of the American Jewish groups. And by that, I should just quickly throw it out there, because nowadays everyone talks about bombing Auschwitz. None of the Jewish groups were talking about bombing Auschwitz at that time, not yet anyways. So their major recommendations had to do with, let's create a government agency that will be devoted towards helping the Jews, what later basically became the War Refugee Board. That was one of their major recommendations. Negotiating with the Nazis to release the Jews. And this also was taken off the table. You may not negotiate with the Nazis to release the Jews. So in other words, like I said, most avenues of escape, the Bermuda Conference was hampered before it even began. It was put in a straitjacket before it even began. So there was very limited options for the delegates to discuss when they got to the table. Now, the first day of the conference, Blum did try to push very hard for America to negotiate with the Nazis. Let's see, maybe Hitler will release some of their of the Jews, and maybe they could. Well, then the question was, where will they go? That was the response to Blum. If Hitler, and that's very ironic, and Madoff, Raphael Madoff, the historian, constantly highlights this issue, as does David Wyman, how embarrassing it is, because the delegates said very clearly, if Hitler says yes to us and says, okay, I will release the Jews from Poland, let's say, there was nowhere for them to go, because England and America had no interest in taking them, because of the immigration laws, because of a desire to avoid the issue that this is a Jewish war. So what will we do if the Nazis actually say yes? But Blum tried anyways to convince the delegates, maybe we could negotiate with the Nazis, until his fellow delegates said, look, this is against the policy of our government. We may not negotiate with the Nazis. And really, most of the Bermuda Conference came down to, perhaps what we could do is set up a camp for Jewish refugees, they called them, in North Africa. So there were many Jews in Spain already, 5,000 Jews who had escaped to Spain. And there was concern that Spain is not going to let an endless number of Jews enter Spain. If we could take these 5,000 Jews out of Spain and bring them to North Africa, then Spain will be willing to take in more Jewish refugees, and we kind of have like an avenue of escape through Spain going to North Africa. And that was the main.
Let's also comment and make clear that in 1943, the United States and Great Britain already controlled North Africa. So when you speak about bringing refugees from Spain to North Africa, this is already American held territory. We had advanced in North Africa. In fact, we were moving up to Italy and entering, as it were, continental Europe. Let me make one more point, which we'll come back to. It was only in January 1944, and I want us to recall the date, in January 1944, when the War Refugee Board was established, January 22nd, 44, when the War Refugee Board was established, that for the first time, American officials could negotiate with the Nazis regarding the situation of the refugees, quotation marks, meaning the Jews. And that meant you had a very interesting situation. If Ira Hirschman negotiated with the Nazis in Turkey, he was a representative of the War Refugee Board. If he negotiated with the Nazis in Turkey, it was okay. If Steinhardt, Ambassador Steinhardt, also another Jew who was our ambassador to Turkey, if he had negotiated, that would have been regarded as treason. And that tells you a little bit about what happened with the loosening of restrictions and the creativity involved. So we have a question here by a gentleman who says the following: Congressman Seller called Blum a sycophant of the State Department. Could you comment on that?
He was very friendly with people like Cordell Hull, the Secretary of State, very friendly with Breckinridge Long, who was for a long time responsible for immigration to America. I don't think he was a sycophant. I think he was the chairman of the Foreign Affairs Committee. When you're in that position, especially during a world war, your obligation is basically to be a team player. That's a point I try to make several times in my book, in my dissertation, which is that Blum was not a Jewish leader. He was an American congressman. And when you're an American congressman, you have to look out first and foremost for the interests of America, especially when you're fighting a world war, when there are 1 million of American servicemen in the Army, the Navy, and the Air Force whose lives are in peril. And so, yes, he worked.
Well, and let's add the most basic thing, and the United States of America felt in peril. it had come to Pearl Harbor, and we were attacked in the United States of America. And we felt not only were our servicemen fighting over there, but we were also feeling the tremendous peril. So one had a very different attitude toward the State Department at that point. Breckinridge Long, again, was the figure in the State Department who was rightfully condemned for his opposition to all forms of immigration and is correctly considered an anti-Semite. So, but nevertheless, to be effective, you at least have to be engaged with him, and that's important. We have a question: was the congressman involved in the bill to create the War Refugee Board? The War Refugee Board was created by Franklin Delano Roosevelt by executive order, and it came after a confrontation between Morgenthau's staff and Morgenthau took a report to the president called on the acquiescence of the American government to the murder of the European Jews. Roosevelt asked him, January 44 is an election year, what do you want? And he said, I want the War Refugee Board. And 6 days later, January 16th to 22nd, the War Refugee Board was created. So clearly it was a problem to be addressed and to be addressed quickly. And was it related to America being in election year? I can't imagine that any politician doesn't know when they're up to for re-election. How does did the U.S. provide you? I'm going to ask some questions, and we can go through this quickly. Did the U.S. provide the USSR with supplies specifically earmarked to be delivered to partisans?
I apologize. I don't know the answer to that question, but I'm sure you do.
I think the answer to that would be no. We provided the USSR with the material to fight the war. What they did with the material was their decision, and they had mixed record in terms of providing material to partisans, most especially to Jewish partisans who were fighting, sometimes integrated into Soviet Union, still hiding that they were Jewish, and sometimes separately themselves. We're asked, was the British mandate a good part of the problem about resettling Jews?
Well, England had signed a white paper or issued a white paper in 38, I think, somewhere around there, capping Jewish immigration to Palestine, I believe at 75,000 over the next 5 years. And it was Jews were outraged, but once the war began, it was very hard to change that policy because the basic argument, which is probably true, is we're in a world war. We can't afford for the Arabs to be upset at us during a world war. We can't afford for there to be a mini Arab uprising in Iraq or other Arab countries. So at least as long as the war is lasting, we cannot change that policy. Again, Jews were outraged, and possibly, Jews perhaps died for that reason, but it's very hard to answer that argument by England, which is we just can't afford a mini rebellion in our backyard while we're trying to fight the Nazis.
And Ben-Gurion had a brilliant policy on that. He said, we shall fight the Nazis on the side of the British as if there is no white paper, and we shall fight the British on the white paper as if there is no war with the Nazis. And that's a nuanced policy which says we're all in the world war, but we're also have to be all in with the battle against the white paper, which was not life and death for the Yishuv, for the Jewish settlement in Palestine, but was life and death for Jews trying to find a place to flee to in Europe. Chaim Weizmann once said, the world was divided to places where Jews could not live and places where Jews could not go. And the quota system was one, and the white paper was certainly another. What got you interested in Saul Bloom?
So I had written a term paper on him in graduate school, and the term paper was on calendar reform. It was a calendar reform movement in the 1920s and 30s. It was a very powerful movement at the time, an international movement at the time. The League of Nations was involved. And the idea was that our calendar, the Gregorian calendar, is not rational, it's not scientific, it's not business friendly. Some months are 30 days, other months are 31 days, one month is 28 days. There are some months that have 4 weekends, other months have 5 weekends. Every month starts on a different day of the week. Every year starts on a different day of the week. So it's not elegant, it's not tidy, like the metric system is tidy, right? There are 1,000 millimeters in a meter, 1,000 meters in a kilometer. It's not neat, it's not tidy, it's also not business friendly. If I want to, for example, compare sales June 19th this year to sales of June 19th last year, you can't really do that because this year, June 19th was a Monday, last year it was a Sunday. You can't compare Monday sales to Sunday sales. So there was a movement to change the calendar. And the main proposal that was being advanced was a 13-month calendar. Every month would be exactly 28 days, so exactly 4 weeks. Every month would start on a Sunday. Every year would start on a Sunday. The only problem with this proposal is that the Earth and Sun do not cooperate. 365 is not divisible by 7. Earth goes around the sun every 365 days. If you divide that by 7, you get 52, remainder 1. What do you do with the remainder 1? So basically the proposal was to affix a blank day at the end of the year. In other words, December 28th would be Saturday. The next day would be blank day, literally nothing. And then 2 days later would be January 1st, Sunday. So effectively, the last week of the year would be an 8-day week, which is fine, a little strange, but fine, unless you're a Sabbath observant Jew, in which case it's not fine, because you have to observe the Sabbath every 7 days. You can't have this fiction of there being a blank day. So if this calendar were adopted, December 28th is a Saturday, okay. The next day for a Sabbath observant Jew, he would have to consider the next day to be Yom Rishon, the first day of a new week. But the rest of the world would be considering it a blank day. And then 2 days later, which would be regarded as Sunday, January 1st, a Sabbath observant Jew would have to regard as being Yom Sheni, Monday. So there was a movement at a certain point to get America first to adopt this calendar. If America adopts this new calendar, the rest of the world will follow. And so they were trying to push a resolution through Congress, basically saying that we think this calendar reform is a good idea. And Orthodox Jewish leaders must have gotten to Saul Bloom because he fought this calendar reform movement very strongly, very vigorously. And he was the only one who seemed to really have a strong opinion on the topic one way or the other. The other members of the committee didn't really have an opinion, but Saul Bloom had a very firm opinion. He brought in 5 rabbis to testify against the calendar reform proposal, 1 reform rabbi, 1 conservative rabbi, 3 Orthodox rabbis, Bernard Drachman, Moses Hyamson, Mortimer Cohen, Abram Simon, and David DeSola Poole. They all testified against it. There was 3 Christians who testified against it. They were the leaders of the Seventh-day Baptist and Seventh-day Adventist movements. So it wasn't exactly a mainstream Christian opposition.
We should explain the Seventh-day Baptists, Seventh-day Adventists observe the Sabbath as the Jews on Saturday. And,
Yes.
and consequently, and we also should say that what a congressman who is chairman of a committee controls who appears before that committee. So he had quite a lineup.
Right. Okay. True. But this fight actually was late 28, early 29. Bloom was not yet the chairman of the committee. So somehow he got all of his witnesses to testify anyways. And he basically succeeded in killing this bill in committee. And he was very vigorous in his opposition. And so when I was thinking about what should I do my PhD dissertation on, I decided to look a little more into Saul Bloom. And then I was very surprised to learn that Holocaust historians were blaming him for doing almost nothing to help Jews during the Holocaust and portraying him as this timid, insecure Jew. And I said to myself, this is not the Saul Bloom I know from the calendar reform fight. So that's
now,
how
why did you entitle your book America First?
Well,
and again, that's a major issue because it has a meaning in 1938, 39, 40, and 41, and it has a meaning in 2016, 17, 18, 19, 20 through 23. And you're titling it that way. Let's put you on the coals a little bit.
So I was debating that issue. And in my PhD dissertation, I was very careful never to use the phrase America first. I talked often about putting America's interests first, but I never actually used the phrase America first because I do know that it has this resonance. And it's also, you can even argue, and that's why I changed the title for a while, although I think I'm going back to America First now, because the truth is, in the context of the time, Bloom was against the America First movement. He was what was known at the time as an interventionist, as intervening in European affairs, not because we were such humanitarians, but because most interventionists thought that if we don't intervene now, we'll get it much worse later. So we have to intervene because America's interests are at stake. But he was not a part of the America First movement whatsoever. If anything, the America First movement was against him. And I know it has a resonance nowadays that's associated with Trump. I picked it partially because it's controversial, and you sometimes want to pick a controversial title for your book. And it does accurately describe what Bloom was doing during the war years, which was putting America's interests above anything else. And I'll just quickly throw out there, a hero to people like Raphael Madoff and people on the right is Peter Bergson, or Hillel Cook, who actually, my mother knew him personally. My mother was a friend with one of his daughters. And he was, I think he was sort of a hero. He comes to this country, he's in his 20s, and he kind of turns the American Jewish scene upside down. He's buying these full-page ads in the New York Times, had never been done before. And he's, again, I think he was 28 in 1943. And he's doing all these new things that have never been done. He has this rabbis' march in Washington, 400 rabbis. He's partially responsible for the creation of the War Refugee Board. I know Henry Morgenthau was directly responsible, but it's very plausible to argue that Peter Bergson sort of laid the groundwork for that. So I think he was a hero, but I think we have to remember Peter Bergson was a Palestinian Jew. And all 6 founding members of the Bergson group were Palestinian Jews. They owed no allegiance to America whatsoever. All they cared about was the Jewish people. American Jews cared about America also, and Saul Bloom was an American congressman, so he had to care about America first. He had to care about America first. And he says that in, one second, let me get a quote for you. He writes that in a letter in 1939 to somebody, a private letter. He says, "My duty as I see it comes first as an American. All else, whatever it may be, is secondary." So that's the way he regarded his duties. And he wasn't the only one. Proskauer, who was one of the heads of the American Jewish Committee, he was against a boycott of Nazi Germany in 1933 because he said it's going to harm the American economy. When there was a loan being debated in Congress to England after the war, there were some Jews who didn't want America to give England that loan because they said England is now harming our interests in Palestine. It's not letting us create a Jewish state. And Bloom and Proskauer and Stephen Weiss all said, we agree with you, we're not happy with England, but when we're discussing an American loan to England, we have to consider, is it good for America? First and foremost, we have to consider, is it good for America? And it is good for America, and therefore we have to support it as much as we don't like what England is doing to the Jewish people in Palestine. So it does, America First does fit, but I agree with you, it's somewhat controversial, and I am playing a little bit with fire by using that title.
How would you like history to remember Saul Bloom? That's asking you essentially, I mean, it's not a trick question. It's asking you to summarize the thesis of your book in 3 minutes or less.
As a caring Jew, as a proud Jew, as a caring Jew, he was a character also. If you read his autobiography, he was a very interesting, the Yiddish expression would be a chevraman. He was very outgoing. He did all sorts of interesting things. This is not Jewish related at all, but even after he finished being the director of the bicentennial celebration of George Washington, a few years after that, he still wanted to promote George Washington. So he challenged Walter Johnson, who was a retired all-star baseball player, to throw a silver dollar across one of the rivers, not the Potomac River, another river whose name I forget, has a much longer name, in Washington, D.C. Why? Because George Washington, according to legend, had thrown a silver dollar across that river, and there was controversy. Is that just a tall tale? Is it possible for George Washington to have thrown a silver dollar across the river? So Saul Bloom publicly challenged Walter Johnson and put down money challenging him. Could you throw a silver dollar across that river? It became a story, a front page story in the New York Times. So he was very good at creating front page headlines. This is Jewish related. He once challenged Henry Ford when Henry Ford's newspaper, the Dearborn Independent, accused the international Jew of running the Federal Reserve. Saul Bloom said, that's a very strong accusation. I would love for you to come to Congress and please prove to Congress that the international Jew really does control the Federal Reserve. Because if he does, it's very important for national security for me to know about it. And it became, again, a national news story, was reported in the New York Times like 5 to 10 times. And that was all Saul Bloom's creation. If not for Saul Bloom making it a national news story, it would not have been a national news story. So Saul Bloom was a character, I think a very, very caring Jew, a very passionate Jew. And on the war, you could argue he had a mixed record. Oh, I didn't even mention, behind the scenes, he tried to help Jews a lot. If you came to him and said, my uncle is stuck in France or my aunt is stuck in Hungary, he would try to help you as much as he could. And he did help many people. He helped save some prominent people. He helped save the Ger Rebbe. The Ger was possibly the largest Hasidic group in Poland at the time. It's the largest Hasidic group in Israel today. He helped save the Rebbe of Ger and his entire immediate family because you needed transit visas out of Poland, and one of the easiest transit visas to get was Italian transit visas. Because Saul Bloom was a very powerful congressman, and because he was on good terms with the administration, he was able to use his connections with the officials at the Italian embassy to get travel visas for the Ger Rebbe. And when Saul Bloom died, the Ger Hasidim in Israel put a in memoriam notice in the New York Times thanking Saul Bloom for saving the Ger Rebbe and his immediate family. So Bloom helped save many people privately. It's true he never publicly castigated FDR, and maybe you could argue here and there, maybe he could have done a little bit more, and maybe he trusted FDR too much. These are arguments you could make, but he did help many people privately. And I think he definitely should get credit for that. And he definitely should get credit for steering Lend-Lease and cash and carry through Congress, because it was those pieces of legislation that helped England, that helped America, and therefore indirectly helped possibly save many lives in England, in Palestine, and possibly even the Soviet Union, because had Germany succeeded in making England surrender, it would have taken its focus east and focused more on the Eastern Front, and who knows how many more Jews on the Eastern Front would have been killed if not for that.
And we also have to remember, especially at this moment in history, that the Soviet Union was allied with the United States after June 1941, after Germany had attacked the Soviet Union and broken the Ribbentrop-Molotov pact. And consequently, arming the Soviet Union was enormously important, even though we opposed communism, because the Soviet Union pushed very hard westward from deep in underneath German occupation, pushed westward, and indeed conquered and quotation marks. I don't want to use the word liberated Poland, because the Poles do not feel that they were liberated. They felt that they had another occupation. So that was terribly important. And again, as I pointed out, and as you well know, Elliot, the most important element is it got America into its military-industrial complex for better during World War II, because we were able to create the infrastructure that ultimately allowed us to fight the war and to defeat Nazism and to provide arms both for the United States, England, and the Soviet Union. And this was really important. Last question. We've been complimented on a wonderful presentation. The credit goes to you, but we've asked, how did European political leaders view Saul Bloom? And were there efforts to influence him by European leaders? Because we know that the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and the House Foreign Affairs Committee are regarded as international figures who are worthy of what shall we say, of lobbying and getting close to. Because if you want to be effective in Congress, you need their cooperation.
So Saul Bloom, he would dine all the time in Washington, D.C. at these parties. I think someone says he showed up in more of these parties than almost anybody else. So he had a tremendous amount of connections for that reason. I'm not aware of any influence peddling, at least in his letters. I saw his,
I don't mean influence peddling, and I don't mean it negatively. I just mean what was the influence with regard, how much did they try to influence him? We're not accusing him of any sort of influence peddling.
Right. So if they did it, I guess, in in-person conversations, because I went through his papers in the New York Public Library. There are 62 boxes, big boxes of Saul Bloom's papers, tens of thousands, perhaps more of documents. No, I think even more than that. And it took me, several weeks, even more than that. It's been a while to go through all of them, or as quickly go through all of them. I don't recall seeing any letters where some foreign leaders writing to Bloom saying, please help me do this or do that. So if that happened, it happened in in-person conversations, not in his letters, and that's the only thing I had access to.
Okay, well, Elliot, I look forward to the publication of your book. I've already read it in manuscript form, but it will enjoy an honored place on my bookshelf. You have changed one man's view of Saul Bloom, and you've added very nicely to our understanding of the American context. I want to say to our group, who has been with us for all of these sessions, that we've come a long way in our understanding of how sophisticated the problem was, how many forces were at work, and how much there is to understand about the role of the United States and the role of particular people. We've also seen something else which should inspire us as well, which is that one person can really make a difference. And it depends on what you do with the opportunities that are available to you. So thank you, Elliot. Thank you, Erica. Thank you to Classrooms Without Borders. We will have a session in the fall. We haven't worked out the topics, and I am about to leave for Poland tomorrow, and we'll be able to meet with the Classrooms Without Borders teachers as I arrive and as they depart. So Poland's not big enough for both of us at the same time, but we'll be ships in passing. Thank you very much, and have a good summer.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, Michael and Elliot, for this really informative and fascinating discussion. It's not so surprising to see that Bloom, like many of the other people that we've learned about in this series, Varian Fry, Ben Hecht, Eleanor Roosevelt. Someone asked a question about Eleanor Roosevelt. You can go back and view that conversation if you want to know more about her influence. And these very complex people and these complex situations and that Jewish leadership faced during this time. It was not easy, obviously, and people had to do the best that they could with the information that they had. So I want to thank you for that. And again, also thank you to our partners, Liberation 75 and the Holocaust Memorial Resource and Education Center of Florida. This is not only our final session of this series, but our final session before we take a break for the summer months. Our summer travel study seminars are in full swing right now, and you can follow them if you go to our website. I'm going to put the address in the chat for our blogs. We have wonderful blogs from our educators and participants who are in Poland right now. You can look back and see the ones from our civil rights seminar, which are just incredible, the experiences that our educators are having and what they share with us about what they're learning and how they're moved. So we'll start again in September. The next program that we're starting with in September 21st is a continuation of our series, The Holocaust as Interdisciplinary Tapestry. We'll be with Tali Nates and our friends at the Holocaust Center in Johannesburg. And we'll have more programs. Like you said, we'll be seeing Dr. Berenbaum regularly, and you can visit our website to check out what's going on there. As you know, we do not charge for our virtual programming, and our mission is to reach as many people as possible. As we've had people from all over, and we appreciate it if you feel able to make a contribution to support these programs. go again to our website and you can make a donation there. And I'll put that into the chat as well, if I can get my fingers to work. And finally, we would like to wish you a good summer, stay safe and healthy. And we hope to see you again in the fall when we resume our regular programming. Thank you again, Elliot, and thank you again, Michael. We'll see you all